history of Christianity is, of course, incredibly long, complex, and rich. And there is no way that a short video like this can possibly do justice to it. What we'd really like to emphasize here is really the highlights in this kind of long and complicated history, especially as it relates to three themes. Those themes are kind of the history of Christianity and its relationship to Judaism, how it grew out of Judaism. Second, Christianity and power, right? How it is that unlike Judaism, Christianity moved into the center of the power of an empire. And third, unlike Judaism and Islam, Christianity is very much based on doctrine and belief. And that plays an important role in how we understand the history of Christianity. So to begin, of course, Christianity begins with Jesus. It turns out that we actually know incredibly little about Jesus as a historical figure. So we have to reconstruct what we think we know about Jesus really from two sources. Those are the Gospels, which are written quite a bit later after the life of Jesus, and also one very small testimony of a Jewish historian named Josephus. Josephus is almost our only contemporary evidence outside of the New Testament for the existence of Jesus. The problem with the Gospels, right, is that the Gospels break up into two kinds of Gospels. There are three Gospels called the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We'll talk about those more in another video. But they're called synoptic because they basically repeat a lot from each other. They draw on the same kinds of sources. You're getting mentions of Jesus that are first kind of created later, and they're traditions, and second, that draw on each other. So that makes the entire historical reconstruction very difficult. So what do we know about Jesus? First, we're pretty sure, as scholars, that Jesus, was born and died a Jew. He spoke Aramaic. He may have known some Hebrew, may have known some Greek, and that he created a following, right? People kind of went around him. Now, what did he do, actually? That is far more complicated to understand from simply the gospel accounts. He seems to have wandered the countryside. He was a healer, and that would have attracted a certain amount of Jewish following. And he also was apocalyptic, in that he seemed to have a message or preach the coming end of the world. That fit very much into the kind of contemporary Jewish context of the time. So in that way, the Jesus movement, we might call it, right, or the followers of Jesus, were Jews, and it was another Jewish group, like many other Jewish groups at the time, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes. Right? Jesus was just among them. Jesus himself seems never to have at least claimed to be a god. So you begin to see the emergence of the Jesus movement as a Jewish movement, a relatively small Jewish movement. And in fact, Jesus attracts very little attention outside of this very small group of followers. And that accounts to some extent by why he's hardly mentioned at all outside of the Gospels by any contemporary historical source. What he does attract, though, is the notice of the Romans. And that is because any kind of religious movement at that time would attract the notice of the Romans as a potential political threat. So when Jesus is put to death by the Romans, it is as a political kind of punishment. Jesus was seen as the leader of a movement that could potentially destabilize Rome. After Jesus dies, his mantle is taken over by his brother James, it seems. And there too, we have what seems to be a Jewish group that is focused around the growing idea that Jesus was the Messiah that was predicted in the Hebrew Bible. That begins to change very quickly with Paul. So Paul is the man who kind of goes out to the Gentiles, to the non-Jews, and says that the way we interpret Jesus and the meaning of Jesus is through his death and the path that it opens up to non-Jews. Whereas where James was saying Jesus is the Messiah prophesied of the Hebrew Bible for Jews, Paul reinterpreted the meaning of Jesus' life to say that actually he also was opening the door to God's promise to non-Jews. Now, this creates a certain status problem. And that has to understand that status problem, that has to do with the Roman Empire and how we understand these groups, these ethnic and religious groups within that Roman Empire. And the problem is this. Jews were tolerated by the Roman Empire. They were seen as an ancient, if strange, kind of religious and ethnic group. If you were Jewish, you had certain kinds of legal statuses and legal exemptions. You didn't have to sacrifice, for example, to the gods of the city. If you're Gentile, that is, if you're non-Jewish, if you're a Roman, of course, that would have naturally been expected to you. The problem comes when you think about what are Gentiles who now follow Jesus. Are they Jews or are they Romans? This was a great problem. Of course, they end up calling themselves, from some time around the time of Paul, maybe a little bit after, Christians. That is somebody who's separate. Because they didn't want to identify as Jews, but they weren't quite Romans. But that put them in this very difficult space in which they didn't have the same legal exemptions that Jews had, but they also didn't want to follow certain kinds of Roman religious customs. That would lead later on to Christians being looked down upon by Romans and even persecuted by Rome and the Romans through the late 1st and 2nd centuries. It also shaped this notion of Christian missionizing, or the idea of Christian missionizing. Right? So Paul went out and kind of got these Gentiles he spread the message of Christ. Christ meaning the Messiah, or the anointed one, quite literally, to the Gentiles. And the Gentiles then, that kind of put the germ of the missionizing impulse into Christianity. In fact, we'll see this throughout Christian history. And it spreads at certain points within Christian history. The idea that the mission of the Christians is to spread the word of Christ to non-Christians. So, in the 2nd and in the 3rd centuries, we actually see a flowering of Christian sects because there's no central authority. Right? We have these different churches that are established by Paul, and there are other churches that come onto the scene. The churches aren't like the church that we're in now. The churches were small groups of people, often gathering in houses, it seems. These different groups began to consolidate a little bit. There were bishops that were appointed, and the bishops ultimately took on priests, presbyters, to kind of administer the sacraments to these local churches. So as Christianity began to grow, which it seems to have done fairly slowly through the 1st and picked up some steam in the 2nd and the 3rd centuries, right? It also continued to attract the attention of Rome. That created persecution, right? Rome began to persecute these Christians who they didn't understand. They didn't fall into the typical statuses. And then the Christian groups began to consolidate to some extent. But there's still a tremendous amount of variety. And at the same time, it created martyrs, Christians who died for their faith. And that brought up an entire theology of the importance and the value of martyrdom, which remains an important part of Christian rhetoric to the present day, among both Catholics and Protestants, for that reason. So in a sense, we could talk about, sometimes we talk about the parting of ways between Judaism and Christianity, but it's not neat or clean. So among the non-Jewish and Greek-speaking Gentiles, right, they never were Jews. But there were always continuing on Jewish followers of Jesus, although it was a relatively small group. So you began to see through the 2nd and the 3rd centuries especially a growth of a Gentile church that is not connected to any living Jewish community or tradition. In that way, you could say Christianity departs from Judaism. But there's also a kind of back and forth, because Jewish communities are looking at these growing Christian communities too, and they're kind of in dialogue, in a cultural and religious dialogue with those groups. So today, scholars actually, rather than talking about a time at which these two religions kind of started at the beginning and diverged, they kind of think of a more interweaving model in which Judaism and Christianity continue to influence and to act on each other through time. Now, this situation changes dramatically in the early 4th century with the conversion of Constantine, because Constantine first makes Christianity legal. It ends all the persecutions, and later on, Constantine's followers will actually make it the preferred religion of the Roman Empire. Once it becomes the preferred religion of the Roman Empire, it needs to define itself. That definition of creating one Christianity out of many Christianities is kind of the formation of an orthodoxy. That formation was kind of centered around hierarchy. Right? There was a central line of bishops that, in a sense, worked with, in tension with, reported to, that there was always a certain kind of tension to the Roman Empire and the Roman emperor. A second way in which that orthodoxy was founded was through the consolidation of the documents that were floating around at the time that Christians used. That consolidation ended up into the New Testament and the Christian Bible generally. The New Testament books were written in Greek. Ultimately, those get translated by St. Jerome into Latin, and it becomes known as the Vulgate. The Christian Bible in Latin is the Vulgate and becomes the kind of defining central text of Western Christianity, whereas the defining text of the Eastern Church, right, remained Greek. So Christianity grows. It grows both in the West and the East. Eastern Christianity doesn't fully fall, but it becomes limited and challenged by the invasion of the Muslims in the 7th century. Meanwhile, in the West, Christianity becomes a very important political player. It kind of, again, grows under the primacy of a pope into a political force that can be employed either with or against certain Christian emperors in the West. Again, this is the Latin West. Ultimately, those two branches of Christianity, of the West, Latin-speaking, and the East, Greek-speaking, split. They do so for a number of reasons. One is simply the language, right? They have problems understanding each other. But another reason is the theological differences that begin to emerge. Whereas Christianity, Western Christianity, was kind of focusing itself on issues of sin and judgment, Eastern Christianity is focusing more on joy and resurrection. That is a very simplistic way to understand some of these theological disputes, which got fairly abstruse, but it ended up in this larger split, which also split the hierarchies. So the Eastern Christians do not see the Pope of the Catholic Church, or the Roman Catholic Church today, as their spiritual leader. Instead, they have individual patriarchs for the different Orthodox groups. The Crusades brought into particular relief and tension the relationship between the secular powers run by the king and the religious powers of the Pope. So here, right, kind of kings and the Pope could work together. Kings could earn the support of the Pope and Christian authorities by going on these crusades, or they could also at times work in tension and apart from one another, with each party furthering its own aims. This also becomes a critical moment for the relationship between Christianity and Islam, because the Crusades, of course, were directed against the Muslim authority over Jerusalem. And it's that historical memory for the Muslims, right, who otherwise have a fairly if not benign, even favorable view of Christianity, and certainly of Jesus, right, that set in motion this tension between Christianity and Islam, or this clash of religion, and we see the after effects of that even today. Beginning in the 16th century, then we see a kind of breakup of this political and religious alliance and power, and that comes in the form of the Reformation. The Reformation is commonly attributed to Martin Luther. Martin Luther, in his 95 Theses, sets out a series of protests against the Roman Catholic Church. Those protests in the end really focus on just a few things that, again, we'll talk about more in another video. But the protests end up being against the Catholic hierarchy, corruption in the Catholic Church, and the corruption of Christian tradition and the message of Christ as understood by Martin Luther. So Luther, he emphasized faith over works. That means that salvation was going to be obtained through faith and not by doing things, right, like in the sacraments. And also a doctrine called sola scriptura, Scripture alone, which is that individuals have their own ability to interpret Scripture. And it's those interpretations of Scripture that become kind of binding on the individual. So there are different Protestant groups. As I said, Martin Luther begins this movement, but it splits off in different ways. One group, for example, that we might mention here are the Anabaptists. So the Anabaptists are a group that believe that baptism can occur only by adults. Of course, that is what modern Baptists and other Anabaptist groups do, right? They baptize as adults, unlike, for example, Roman Catholics who baptize when they are young. Anabaptists are interesting because they form a kind of natural, logical end to Luther's thinking, is that in order to accept Jesus, in order to accept Christ, one has to be an adult. One has to do this with full consciousness. And of course, Luther and the Protestant movement is integrally connected to changing ideas and thoughts within his own community. So we begin to see the emergence then, another emergence in the West of a tremendous amount of diversity among people who call themselves Christians. The Roman Catholic Church still reigns supreme, and to this day still does. It is the largest church of any religion in the world today, but there's a whole variety of Protestant groups. And those Protestant groups are splitting up due to reasons primarily of doctrine and doctrinal difference. So when you have a group like the Anabaptists will split with other Protestant groups like the Anglicans in moving forward, their own theological ideas. When we get into the modern world, right, and we start moving into the Enlightenment and scientific thinking and the like, we see a moment of challenge and response between the world and the church, or churches. So in the northern and western Christian groups, we see a response to the challenges of scientific thinking, of the new political order, of a democratic system, of the decline of kings, in a great amount of variety. Now that gets expressed in different ways. If we focus for a second here on the Roman Catholic side, we see the growth and development of different orders. Orders emerged as kind of different groups within the church. They emerged starting in the Middle Ages, but their role begins to change in modernity, whether they're Jesuits or Franciscans, or there are other orders as well in America. They are monastic, or they start as mainly monastic orders, but then they grow out into the world. They don't simply recluse themselves. So, for example, we see Jesuit universities like Georgetown or Providence College is from an order, or Notre Dame is from an order. So that ends up being one kind of response to modernity. Vatican II, right, which is a synod in the 1960s, early 1960s, run by the Roman Catholic, was a huge change in the Roman Catholic Church as a response to modernity. So among the different reformations made in Vatican II in the Church was a move of the Mass, right, the kind of central part of the Roman Catholic service, from Latin into the vernacular. So if you go to a Catholic service in the United States, you will almost certainly, it will be in English or sometimes Spanish, sometimes Korean, depending on which church you go to. But it will be in the vernacular language of the people sitting there, in nearly all of them. There are a few holdouts that continue to celebrate Mass in Latin, but they're very few. Among the other reformations of Vatican II was a recalibration of the relationship between Catholics and Jews. And this is also some 20 years or so after World War II and the Holocaust. So Vatican II begins a movement in the Church to see Jews as holding an independent path to salvation. That is, in order to be saved, Jews do not need to convert to Catholicism. Jews here are unique. Right? Almost everybody else in Catholic doctrine needs to accept Christ and, in fact, to convert to Catholicism and perform Catholic rites. But Jews seem to occupy a separate path to salvation. Within America today, right, we obviously see challenges for the Catholic Church. Prime among them today, in fact, as I film this, are some of the sexual scandals that are coming into the news. That's not the only challenge, but it's one of many challenges. And as a result, we see a shrinkage of the Catholic Church in the United States today. But that doesn't mean that the Catholic Church is shrinking in the world. It, in fact, is growing in the Southern Hemisphere. And the very shape of Catholicism today is changing. And perhaps that's also reflected in the fact that Pope Francis comes from Argentina, that we're beginning to see a shift in the center of gravity of that church. We want to turn to the Protestant movements for a minute. Protestantism, right, it's not a real thing. It's not an institution, right? It's an umbrella term that we use to kind of put together all of these different groups that were against the Catholic Church. And we've seen the growth recently of evangelical churches, right? Churches that don't align with any of the traditional movements, but that seek to go back as a kind of reformation, right? As Luther did in a sense, to what they see as the original Christianity. Those evangelical churches, right, are largely, but not entirely, also tied to conservative political agendas. And they play a very important role in American culture and politics today. But there are also liberal churches. And those liberal churches are partly denominational and they're partly evangelical. And those liberal churches understand the message of Christ to be one of social justice. They tend to align also with liberal political views. So Protestantism as a whole, you certainly cannot say is either kind of conservative or liberal on our political spectrum, because we have Protestants and Catholics who fall out on both sides. Christianity continues to play an important role in American politics, but that role ends up being very different from the role that it played in medieval societies, in which there were kings with which it was aligned or in tension. In Europe, the situation is a little different, because the church is, in general, have not been doing well in Europe. They've been losing members, and they play less of a role, but still somewhat of a role in their political lives as well.